Nobody checks on the man who seems to have everything. That is the trap nobody warns you about. When you are struggling, when the difficulty is visible, people notice. They ask, they offer, they show up. But when you have built the life that looks complete from the outside, when the house and the career and the reputation are all in place, nobody thinks to look underneath. Why would they? Everything looks fine. I looked fine for 25 years. I was the most visibly successful man in my town, and I was drowning. My name is Gerald. I am 86 years old. I owned and operated a chain of hardware stores. Started with one, grew to 7 over 30 years. In a mid-sized town, that kind of business success has a visibility that is almost inescapable. My name was on the signs. People knew who I was. I was invited to sit on civic boards. People asked my opinion on things. When I walked into a restaurant, I was usually recognized and usually greeted with the specific warmth that people extend to someone they consider significant. I am telling you this not to impress you. I am telling you this because the gap between that external reality and my internal one was, for many years, so large that it constitutes the central fact of my adult life. And I want to tell you about that gap. Here is the thing about success that nobody tells you from the inside. It is, to a significant degree, a performance. Not a fraudulent one necessarily, but a performance, a sustained presentation of a particular version of yourself, confident, certain, capable, in control, that the role of successful person requires. And the performance is rewarding in many ways. People respond to it. They follow, they defer, they look to you for direction. The performance is consistently validated by external reality. But underneath the performance, underneath the confident, certain, capable exterior is a person. A real, complex, uncertain, sometimes frightened person who did not stop being those things just because he learned to perform something else on the surface. And here is the problem. When you are successful enough, people stop looking for the person underneath the performance. They interact with the performance. They respond to the performance. They assume the performance is the whole story because the performance is convincing and because there is no obvious reason to look further. And gradually, because you are human and because we become what we are responded to as you start to live inside the performance, start to lose track of the boundary between the version of you that people see and the version that is actually there. You become the performance. And the person who was always underneath starts to feel like a stranger, someone you used to know but have not visited in a long time. I am describing my own experience, but I suspect it is not only mine. I want to tell you about the night I understood what I had been doing. I was 61 years old. I had just attended a Chamber of Commerce dinner, the kind of event I attended regularly, a room full of people I knew professionally, the kind of gathering where I was reliably at ease because the social role was clear and familiar. I drove home. My wife Eleanor was already asleep. I poured myself a small whiskey, not unusual, and I sat in my study. And I tried to do something I had not done in years. I tried to simply be with myself, without a role, without a task, without an audience. Just Gerald, the actual person, alone in a room. And what I found was, I didn't know him. That is not metaphor. That is as close to a literal description as I can manage. The person I found when I stripped away the successful businessman, the civic figure, the man people recognize, was genuinely unfamiliar to me. His preferences, his actual feelings about his life, his genuine desires as opposed to the desires that made sense given who he was supposed to be, all of it, was opaque to me. I had spent 30 years becoming something for other people, and I had succeeded, and the cost of that success was that I had, somewhere in the process, lost myself. I sat in that study for a long time, not in despair, in a kind of stunned recognition. And then I did something I had almost never done in my adult life. I let myself feel the loneliness. Not the social loneliness of being alone. I was surrounded by people constantly, but the deeper loneliness of a person who is not known, who moves through the world, recognized and respected, and fundamentally unseen, who smiles in photographs and gives speeches and shakes hands, and has dinner with important people, and comes home at night to a private self so unfamiliar that spending time alone with it feels like being in a stranger's house. That loneliness, when I finally let myself feel it, was enormous. It had been there for decades. I had managed it with busyness and performance and the constant, rewarding stimulation of being somebody in a room. But it had never gone away. Now let me tell you what I did next. I told Eleanor. Not that night I didn't know how to begin. But over the following weeks, in the stumbling, inadequate way of a man who has not practiced emotional honesty in 30 years, I told her. I told her that I did not know myself, that the person she had been married to was, in significant part, a performance, that underneath the performance was someone she had never fully met, and I wasn't sure I had either. She listened. And then she said something I will carry forever. She said, "Gerald, I have been waiting to meet that person for 30 years. I married him. I just haven't seen much of him. I was 61 years old. My wife had been married to a performance for 30 years, and she had stayed, and she had waited, for the person she had originally chosen, who had been steadily replaced by a role. I spent the next 25 years. We are still married. She is still here trying to give her the person she had been waiting for. It is the best and the most important work I have ever done." I want to talk about why men, specifically, are so vulnerable to this particular form of self-loss. Because I think it is not accidental, and I think understanding the mechanism is the first step to doing something about it. Men are taught in most cultures, most families, most contexts, that their value is primarily functional, that they are worthwhile insofar as they produce, provide, protect, perform. The emotional, interior, genuine life of a man, his fears, his confusion, his need for connection and understanding, those are not part of the value proposition. In fact, in many contexts they are actively penalized. Signs of weakness, things to be managed, suppressed, overcome. And so we learn very early to perform rather than to be effective rather than genuine, to show the world the version that earns the reward, competent, in control, certain, and to keep everything else out of sight. And we get so good at it. We practice the performance from childhood, and by the time we are adults, we have refined it to the point where it feels natural, where the distance between the performance and the self beneath it is so well maintained that we stop noticing the gap. Until a night in a study at 61, or a retirement, or a health crisis, or a moment when the usual methods of not looking at yourself stop working, and then we find the stranger, and we have to decide what to do with him. Here is what I have learned from 25 years of trying to know the stranger. He was not as frightening as I expected. The things I had been keeping out of sight, the uncertainty, the fear, the need for genuine connection, they were not as dangerous as I had learned to treat them. They were just human. Ordinary human experiences that I had decided were incompatible with the person I had been performing. They weren't incompatible. They were the parts of me that were most genuine, most real, most capable of actual connection. The stranger was not someone to be afraid of. He was the person I had been trying to find my whole life. I want to say something about loneliness and success that I believe is true and that I have almost never heard anyone say clearly. The loneliness of the successful man is not a paradox. It looks like one from the outside. How can a man who is surrounded by people, who is recognized and respected, who has every external indicator of a full life, how can that man be lonely? But it is not a paradox when you understand what loneliness actually is. Loneliness is not the absence of people. Loneliness is the absence of being known. And you can be surrounded by hundreds of people who know the performance and not have a single person who knows the person. That is the specific loneliness of the successful man. The loneliness of being recognized everywhere and known nowhere. And it is, I believe, far more common than anyone acknowledges. Because the men who experience it are not going to talk about it. Talking about it would break the performance. And the performance is too central to their identity to risk. So they carry it. Silently. Behind the confidence and the competence and the handshakes and the speeches, They carry it until something breaks the performance for them, or until they are brave enough to break it themselves. I was lucky. Eleanor waited. Not every man has someone waiting on the other side, but every man deserves to find out who he is when the performance stops. I want you to think about one person in your life, just one who you trust enough to let the performance down with. Not completely, not all at once, just slightly. One moment of saying something true rather than something competent. One conversation where you let some genuine uncertainty or confusion or feeling into the room, rather than managing it out of existence. One person who gets to see a little of what is actually there. Because here is what I know from 25 years of gradually letting Eleanor see who I actually was. Being known genuinely, even partially known, is more nourishing than any amount of being recognized. Recognition feeds the performance. Being known feeds the person. And the person, the actual, genuine, underneath it all personas, the only thing worth feeding. Pick your one person, and let them see a little more of what is actually there. Tell me in the comments, is there a gap between how you appear to the world and who you actually are underneath? Not for judgment, not as a confession. Just to sit there? Because acknowledging it is the beginning of closing it. And closing it even partially, even slowly, is the most worthwhile thing I have ever done.